every single fusion in Steven Universe is representative of the relationship between its components. Fusions like Stefani or Garnet are romantic in nature, fusions like Opal and Smoky Quartz are platonically friendly in nature, and other fusions like Steg are more specific cases, with that example obviously being the father-son relationship. But out of every fusion in the show, none is as inherently interesting, at least to me, as Malachite, a representation of the toxic relationship between Lapis and Jasper. And while we do get little looks at the pairing while they are still fused, the most interesting deep dive into the psychology of the pair actually comes a dozen or so episodes after they permanently disband, in Season 3, Episode 15, Alone at Sea, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the last interaction between Lapis and Jasper, and talk about how, through its unique setting and its fascinating writing, Alone at Sea explores that, despite her continued longing for it, the toxicity of malachite is ultimately something that Lapis must move past.
Hey!
Hey!
Episode kicks off with Steven leading Lapis to a surprise, as he and Greg have rented a boat, with the goal of allowing Lapis to re-engage with her love of the water after all of her ocean-related trauma with malachite. And despite opening with this really dark premise right off the bat, the first half or so of this episode is mostly made up of some really fun Lapis shenanigans. Stuff like her not even recognizing Greg, or the boat being sloppily renamed to Little Lappy make for some great gags. And in general, when she's not reliving trauma or questioning whether or not she's a horrible person, this is one of the funniest Lapis episodes that you can find in the show. Speaking of Greg, from the very beginning of his first conversation with Lapis, it's clear that his attempts to cheer her up aren't exactly going to be very helpful, as introducing himself as the one whose leg was broken when she was inadvertently destroying his planet doesn't really mitigate her growing belief that she's not a good person. Once the trio gets on the boat, this continues, as Greg's innocent invitation for Lapis to take control of the boat causes her to freak out, as her aversion to taking control of anything begins to become fairly apparent. Throughout the entire episode, we constantly see Steven temporarily get Lapis to have a little bit of fun, like when she sees that they renamed the boat from SS Misery, but eventually, seemingly small and insignificant things continue to draw her back towards her last experience in the ocean. Despite Steven having the initial right idea about Lapis needing to confront the ocean in order to finally get past the experience of malachite, once they get on the boat, his new approach is seemingly to try and get Lapis to think about literally anything else. And while this idea of bringing fun into Lapis's life in order to prevent her from constantly thinking about what Steven perceives as just a complete horrible experience is a decent idea, but the issue comes from the fact that he's unaware of what Lapis's actual issue is. The reason that Lapis isn't having fun just running around the boat isn't because her mind is occupied with what happened with Jasper. The reason that Lapis can't enjoy anything is because she believes that she doesn't deserve to be happy. And while this analysis comes from the knowledge of the revelation later in the episode, Lapis actually straight up tells Steven this before ever getting on the boat.
Steven, I don't deserve this.
Of course you do.
While Steven initially interprets this as her being humble, in actuality, this line is Lapis trying to avoid the cognitive dissonance of her experiencing joy while believing that she deserves misery. Moving on, eventually, after the montage, we get to a part of the episode that, while it is very easy to miss on a first watch, contains one of my favorite metaphors in the entirety of the series. When Greg mentions that he's fishing, Lapis decides that she can finally prove herself to be a good person, only to find him somewhat freaked out by her massive display of power, as she interprets fishing as something a little bit different than what Greg had in mind. And it's when Lapis, full of shame for what she did, asks Greg about his style of fishing that we get one of the most clever bits of writing in the entire show.
Why would a fish ever bite a hook?
You gotta bait it. Put something on it you know it wants.
And if you don't know where I'm going with this is going to sound kind of dumb, but as a metaphor, fishing is malachite. Whereas fishing is baiting a fish with what they want most, food, only to pull them out of their native water and onto the uncomfortable land, malachite was Lapis baiting Jasper with what she wanted most, power, only to pull them off their native land and into the uncomfortable water. And it's this framing of Lapis as something other than the 100% victim of the malachite situation that frames the rest of the episode, as we get one of the most interesting looks at one of the show's most interesting dynamics. After this point, and before this angle is further explored, we get a few hints of who or what is to come. When Lapis is seen again, there's a shadow over her eyes, something that Steven Universe constantly does when they're about to show a darker side of an otherwise likable character. At this point, Lapis begins to say the obvious, that Steven's aim of trying to get her to associate the ocean with fun rather than the past has only caused her to think more about malachite, and the struggle between her and Jasper that made up her life for all of that time. And all of this culminates with what is, in my opinion, one of the hardest hitting lines in the entire show, and one that completely shakes up both this episode and Lapis's character as a whole.
That's not it. I miss her.
What?
As indicated by the music throughout the scene, this line completely shifts everything going on in Alone at Sea. In most episodes of Steven Universe, resolution is guaranteed. The show isn't going to move on with the Earth not having an ocean or with Pearl running away from Steven, but the idea that Lapis might stop being a good guy is a reality that feels very possible in this moment. And before too long, Jasper's reappearance gives Lapis an opportunity to do just that. And in a show with a litany of tense moments, I'm not sure that any feel quite so unpredictable as Lapis and Jasper's conversation here, as the possibility of Malachite's return feels, in a way, almost inevitable. In a scene that parallels the original creation of Malachite, Jasper once again begs Lapis to join her in fusion, except this time, both parties are fully aware of the possibilities if they once again join forces. Even when Lapis attempts to remind Jasper of the horrors of trapping somebody involuntarily at the bottom of the ocean, she doesn't care, desperately missing the power they had in the seldom times that Jasper held control. As she continues to remind Lapis of all the things that are possible when they're together, Jasper also claims that not only will this time be different, but so will Jasper. This brisk conversation also contains perhaps the clearest indicator of this episode's intentions by portraying a relationship like this, as Jasper tries to convince Lapis that she's the only one who could ever handle her power, and that a fusion with Jasper is all that Lapis could ever attain. After all of the horrible things that Lapis has done, Jasper is all she has left. At this point, all of the intensity of the episode suddenly ceases, as Lapis is forced to consider her two options, whether to go back to the life that she understands with Jasper, or the unsure future with the crystal gems. Ultimately though, all it takes is a look at Steven for Lapis to realize that the misery that she experienced with Malachite is perhaps not inevitable, and that she deserves to at least try to find a brighter future. Obviously, hearing this does not exactly please Jasper, who charges Steven in revenge, only to find herself team rocketing away after Lapis strikes her with the same ocean that she's been spending all of this time avoiding. Unfortunately though, this does destroy the boat in the process, as Lapis is forced to carry Steven and his now somewhat less wealthy father to safety. And in the final moments of this episode, as Lapis is finally able to see the ocean for what it is from high above, that she begins the process of trying to actually move past her experiences as Malachite.
The ocean's really beautiful from up here.
Yeah.
After After this episode, Lapis and Jasper never interact again, and while I do think that there was perhaps a good story to be told, especially if Lapis was to have a conversation with the Jasper of future, I think that fully keeping the pair apart was the only way to really respect what Malachite, especially in this episode, was indicated to represent. As you can hopefully tell by this point, Lapis and Jasper are Steven Universe's representation of a toxic relationship, and all of the complexities that come as a part of it, outside of just two people who are mean to each other. The reason that Malachite comes about in the first place is because both parties needed something that they perceived could only be obtained through the other gem. Jasper needed the power of Lapis, and Lapis needed somebody to withstand the anger that she built up after thousands of years of being trapped. Somebody that she could take advantage of without upsetting Steven, the only person she trusted. And I think that last point is actually pretty important when talking about Malachite, and especially when talking about the decision that Lapis makes at the end of this episode. If anything, the people that Lapis should really be releasing her wrath upon are the crystal gems, who are ultimately the ones responsible for her being stuck in the mirror for all those years. But since Steven wouldn't let that happen without a fight, she finds an excuse to do so to Jasper, under the initial excuse of wanting to protect Steven from her, something that the crystal gems, especially with the help of Lapis, could have probably very easily accomplished just by teaming up against Jasper and poofing and bubbling her. And just as he is the reason that Malachite initially forms, Steven is also the reason that she doesn't get a chance to come back. Throughout this entire episode, Lapis constantly talks about all of the different great things that Steven is doing for her, and how she believes that she doesn't deserve any of it. There's just no way to accept nice things when she believes that she is this terrible person who did terrible things to both the Earth and to Jasper. And what better way to make sure that she doesn't have to deal with this feeling of being happier than she deserves than by going back to Malachite, the one place that she knows she'll never accidentally escape misery. And even if, as he said them, they didn't seem to work, it's the words of affirmation by Steven throughout this episode that ultimately encourages Lapis to make the decision to choose a chance of happiness over the certainty of misery, something that the other half of Malachite doesn't exactly take well. And once she's forced above it, Lapis is able to see the beauty of the ocean as she once did without the murkiness of Malachite's legacy clouding it, as the ship, in both senses, sinks into the sea. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want to tell me how it was a boat and not a ship in a way that's harder to ignore in the comments, you can find my Twitter in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a video that has somehow even more water. Thanks for watching.